Hi guys, my name is Paul and I work at Visu Technologies, and I've been in the motor industry for about 37 odd years now, and particularly for the last 24 years I've been tuning, styling, servicing and maintaining Jaguar Land Rover vehicles. I've actually owned at least 3 of these vehicles myself. I'm a big Land Rover fan, absolutely love them, and I thought today we'd spend a little bit of time just walking around one of these vehicles and talking about some of the things we tend to see go wrong with them, and particularly if you're looking to buy a vehicle, something that might help you find a better vehicle and look for some of the issues that occur before you part with any cash. So first of all, we have a lovely Range Rover Sport here. This is the 5-litre supercharged, and as I mentioned, we do tune a lot of vehicles here, and particularly the 5-litre supercharged is a very tunable engine, and therefore we do see quite a lot of them. Before I get too much into the specific things that go wrong with the Range Rovers that we see quite regularly, I'll just give you a little intro of how I like to buy a vehicle and some of the things I like to look for when I'm actually going out to find a vehicle for myself. First of all, generally you find vehicles these days online, be it on some sort of Auto Trader, eBay, etc., type of online listings. And it's very tempting to find a vehicle that looks the right price. You want to be very careful, of course, about scams and all of those things that are out there. But that aside, before I jump in my car and run out to go and see a vehicle, I like to do a little bit of research, probably, if I'm honest, to save myself an awful lot of time. One of the first things I want to look at is MOT history. So if you're watching this from outside of the UK, you might not be quite used to the phrase an MOT. It's Military of Transport, a Military of Transport test. This is often known around the world as a fitness test. Now in the UK, what's really interesting is when a vehicle is put in for its yearly fitness test, the inspector not only passes or fails the vehicle, but it's very common for them to make comments on things that may be observations. So it might not be such a bad issue that it fails its MOT, but it could be something that's going to need doing quite quickly. So by looking at the recent MOT history of a vehicle, in some ways it's almost as good as having an independent inspection carried out. An MOT assessor may say things like suspension bushes are worn or tired, there's rust or corrosion, there's brakes maybe on the upper limit of being worn out, etc., etc. So take your time. Find the vehicle registration, look at the MOT history, maybe over the last 5 years. Not only look at the mileage and make sure it's in line with what you're expecting from the advert of the vehicle, but any comments the MOT inspector may have come up with. I personally find sometimes you'll find the last MOT had such a big list of things that were observed as being worn out, you may even wonder sometimes if that's actually the trigger for the vehicle now being listed for sale. So that's a nice little insight if you're not already doing that. I always like to get a HPI check done on a vehicle. This will show you quite a lot of things. Now, HPI checks used to be quite expensive. They're as little as £9 these days, and it will show you really important things like, is there any outstanding finance on the vehicle? You don't want to part with a lot of hard-earned cash to find out actually you are now not the legal owner of the vehicle. For £9, you can protect yourself from that. So it will show you outstanding finance. It will potentially show you any serious accident damage too, and of course it will also give you an indication of the mileage, which can tie up very nicely with the MOT history mileage. So you start to get a picture of what this vehicle's life looks like, how many owners it's had, the history of the inspections, etc., etc. And then the last thing I like to see on one of these vehicles is the vehicle service history. Now, sometimes the service history, particularly on things like these Range Rovers now, is all online. The owner can download that service history, and I would absolutely expect them to do that and send it to me before I go and look at a vehicle. And now with those 3 pieces of information, you get an idea of how well the vehicle has been looked after, the mileage, the history, etc. And it starts to come together. Is this a good, tidy vehicle? Is it something that you want to go and see? And the other thing, by the way, I'd also like to see is a copy of the inside of the logbook that shows me how many keepers the vehicle's had. That all together now gets me to think, is this a vehicle I want to go and see? And if it is, that's great. So the next stage is, if all that stacks up, the mileage looks right, the service history is where you expect it to be, it's probably time to go and have a look at it. I always ask the seller not to start the vehicle. I want to inspect a cold vehicle. I want to be able to start it and listen to it from quiet. From cold. So do ask that request before you go out. And then when you get out to see the vehicle, before we run in and start driving around, let's slow things down and take a good look at this vehicle. And these are the kind of things I want to look at. When I arrive, obviously, I want to meet the seller of the vehicle. I would ideally like to make sure he is the guy on the logbook and that he is the actual owner, not some sort of trader that stepped in between. But when we actually come to look at the vehicle, one of the first things I want to do is look at the paintwork. I want to know if this vehicle's had any accident damage, etc. So I'll take my time, I'll walk around the vehicle. I'm looking for any overspray anywhere, so typically around a mirror or something like this, or on a door shut, on a rubber. I want to see that all the joins on the vehicle are where I expect them to be and they're nice and even, that the paintwork looks nice and shiny, and try and get down and look at it for any kinks in the paintwork, any flat spots, any dips, anything that might be hiding any filler, any orange peel or anything like that. So take your time, have a good look around the vehicle and make sure, as far as you can tell, it looks like it's not had any serious paintwork. That's always a nice thing to do. Before we start going out on road test, a couple of other things I want to do. Let's take a good look at the tyres on these vehicles. On a 20-inch tyre vehicle, you're going to be spending at least £1,000 on a set of tyres. Some of these vehicles run 22 inches. That's going to be well over £1,200. So you are not going to not buy a vehicle because the tyres are low, but you can save yourself a lot of money if they are low and you want to bring that into the price that you negotiate with the customer. So have a good look. You really want tyres of at least 7mm. Although a minor thing, one thing I do like to see when I'm inspecting a vehicle is the quality of tyre fitted. I think this can show you a lot about the current owner's mindset. If you've got a nice premium brand tyre with good tread on it, to me, that always triggers the idea that the customer's looked after the vehicle. If you're looking at a set of budget tyres that are worn and the tracking's out and it's starting to wear, that also gives me another indication of how this vehicle may have been looked after. So premium brand tyres say quality to me and say the vehicle's been looked after. So it's just something I like to observe, shall we say. Take a good look at the tyres. On the front, you can turn the steering wheel and you can look across the tread all the way across. I do find that these Range Rovers, big old heavy vehicles, often do wear the passenger side on the outside edge, and this is where you're basically leaning them into roundabouts and it can scrub the tyre a little bit. Not particularly unusual, but for the rest of the tyre, and particularly on the inside, you do want to see an inside nice wear tread. You don't want to see any big bald spots or carrying on the inside that might tell you that geometry is out and needs checking. Same for the rears. You're going to have to get down on your hands and knees for this point, but try and get from the back is probably the easiest area, and look again across the whole width of the tyre. Is it nice, good tread depth? One of the things you'll notice on these Range Rovers, quite often the wheel design does mean that the brakes are very accessible. Again, a set of brakes on these cars, pads and discs all round, you're easily going to spend over £1,200 at a main dealer, probably over £800 at a specialist. Save yourself that repair bill or bring it into the negotiation of the price by looking at the pads and the discs. Are the discs very rusty? Have you got a big lip on this part of the disc here that shows you that it's probably down to minimum thickness? And you can really get in and see how much pad material is left too. So it's worth checking that. Again, obviously, it's not that you're not going to buy the vehicle because the brake pads are low, but it does give you an indication of an upcoming repair bill that you might have. So this is the lovely 5-litre supercharged engine, huge amounts of power, and in general they are incredibly reliable. But there are a couple of things that can let these engines down, particularly as we get into slightly higher mileage. And these come into 3 main categories. The first one is the supercharger. Generally, again, the supercharger is very reliable, but they can become noisy, and they become noisy in 2 ways. The main bearings in the main part of the supercharger can become a bit loose and a bit rattly, and what you will hear when you're running the vehicle at idle is a sort of scrapey sound from the top. It's quite noticeable, although it does start very subtle, and as it gets worse the noise becomes louder. So you are listening from idle for any sort of scraping noise from the top of the supercharger engine up here. The other part of these superchargers that can fail is the front coupler bearing. Now you can't see that, there's nothing you can inspect, it's right down under here, under this cover, and the bearing itself is inside a housing anyway. But what you are going to listen for is when the engine is running and you turn it off, the coupler will knock as you turn it off, and you'll get a donk 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 noise as the engine shuts down. The way that you really check if the coupler's got too much free play is you take this cover off, you take the belt off the supercharger pulley, and you can rock the pulley from side to side, and it will go knock 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 as you move it from side to side. Now that's not easy to do as part of a vehicle inspection, but what you are listening for is that knocking noise when you shut down, and it will tell you the same thing: this supercharger needs some work. So can you hear that kind of sort of slightly rough sound? That shouldn't be there. That's what we're listening to, and that is your main supercharger bearings that become noisy. At the moment this engine is cold. As it gets warmer, that noise is going to get quite a lot louder, but it's there all the time as a sort of constant background noise. Okay, so as the engine just shut off there, you heard that slight carry on, that sort of donk, donk, donk. Again, the engine's cold, and so this isn't really loud on this engine, particularly at the moment. It will get worse as the engine gets louder again, but that is the sound of a failing coupler bearing. Another thing that tends to go wrong with these engines is the timing chains can become a bit loose as the engine mileage builds up. Doesn't tend to affect them at lower mileage, but over 50 to 60,000 miles, you can sometimes get a timing chain rattle. It's quite evident when it happens. Again, you can hear it at idle, and you're now hearing a scraping noise from the front of the engine. If you're getting anything like that at all, pull up the handbrake on this sale. That is an expensive repair, and you definitely want to get a professional in to assess that before you go ahead and purchase the vehicle. And then the last thing that can be a bit of a blight on these 5-litre engines is water leaks. And there's a couple of different areas that they leak from. Most of them are underneath the supercharger. There's a couple of different pipes under there. One is called the Y pipe. There's another pipe that runs from the front of the engine to the back of the engine, which is called a throttle cooling pipe. They can leak, and also the water pump can be a bit of a problem on these engines too. So not the easiest thing to inspect for. They do have a low coolant level light inside the vehicle, but any would-be seller that's got a light on like that is almost certainly going to top up the coolant. Not that they're unscrupulous, but of course it's human nature, so the light is now turned off. What you're looking for under the bonnet is, funny enough, is a smell. Any little signs of whips of steam or anything coming out from this cover is not obviously a good sign and should set alarm bells ringing, but also the coolant smells very sweet, a little bit like burnt orange juice. It's quite an acrid sort of nasty smell. Anything that sort of smells sweet and sticky under the bonnet, again, you probably want to get that looked at. You tend not to see the water dripping on the ground because there's a great big under tray under the engine, and where these water leaks particularly are is the water sits in the valley of the V8, and that gets very hot and it evaporates, so you never actually get to see the coolant. What you do get is little whiffs of steam and sometimes that sweet acrid smell. They're the things you want to be looking for both before you go on road test, but most importantly after your road test. Spend some time, bonnet up, having a good look around, see if there's any strange smells coming from under the bonnet or any whiffs of steam. But I don't want to put you off this engine. This is a fabulous, fabulous engine that generates great power and on the whole is incredibly reliable. So before we head out and road test, there's a couple of other things I want you to take a good look at. These vehicles are known for their fantastic, soft, comfortable suspension, but as the vehicles get a little bit older, that can become a bit worn and can give you a couple of issues. One of which is the vehicle sometimes doesn't sit dead level. So take a good walk around the vehicle, stand back and make sure the vehicle is sitting level, both front to back and side to side. As these suspension starts to wear, you can find that one side or one corner will start to sag, sometimes very slightly. Eventually that will fail and be incredibly obvious. But before it fails, quite often you'll notice one side might sag a little bit. So take your time and look at that. And when we do go on road test, it's really important that you test the suspension because it can become quite knocky, quite annoyingly knocky, which can be quite an expensive repair. So when you're out on road test, ideally you want to find some curbs or really a speed bump if you can, and try and drive over the speed bump, not just dead on, but actually on an angle, and go over it a couple of times and see if you can test it and see if you get any knock from the top of the suspension. It's quite common on these as they get older and will indicate that a repair is needed. Other things I'd like you to look at before we go out on road test is oil leaks. These engines generally are very good, but both the engine and the gearbox can develop oil leaks, often from either the sump of the engine or from the crankshaft on the engine. It's quite easy to some extent to see. Bring a torch. Do be prepared to get on your hands and knees and literally get underneath and check the rear diff at the same time for oil leaks. You'll sometimes see a sort of misting or a wetness around the rear diff. All of those things are a good indication that ultimately you've got a repair bill coming sooner or later. Something slightly unusual I want you to look for is rust and corrosion. Now, if the vehicle's sort of 4 or 5 years old, you're probably not going to see this, but you'll be surprised by the time these vehicles get to 10 or so years old, you can get a surprisingly large amount of corrosion. Now, from 2012, all of the bodies on the Land Rover vehicles are aluminium, and I think people often think, oh, it's got an aluminium body, that's never going to rust. but it's what's underneath that matters. You'll find that subframes will often get quite a lot of corrosion, brake lines and other mounting points for suspension components which are not aluminium but are steel can get really quite heavily corroded. If you're going to buy one of these vehicles, it's a really nice sign to see that it's either been treated with some sort of wax protection like wax oil or LanoGuard or something like that, and if it's not been treated, spend a little bit of time looking at things like the rear subframe and suspension mounts and make sure rust hasn't already set in, and if it hasn't set in when you buy it, make sure you treat it. You know, Jaguar Land Rover do have a little bit of a reputation for these vehicles rusting. On our UK roads where there's a lot of road salt, this rust can really set in and do a lot of damage at really sometimes quite surprisingly young vehicles. So take your time, look underneath. Other things these Range Rovers are particularly known for, unfortunately, are problems with the central locking. You should have two keys. Make sure both keys are present. They are expensive to repair, and you want to make sure that all the functions lock and unlock on both keypads. This self-locking button on the boot is often problematic, and you'll find that no longer works, so check that's working okay. Very nice. And if you've got a vehicle with automatic opening of the rear boot, I can pretty much guarantee it won't work. You will find yourself stood in the supermarket car park looking like a deranged Morris dancer, waving your feet around under the vehicle, and still the damn tailgate won't work. Don't have particularly high expectations. I've had 3 of these vehicles, none of them have worked yet. One of my little personal pet hates about these vehicles is scratches on the windows, and this affects both the front and the back windows, and it's a little bit of a design fault if I'm honest. Little stones can get caught in this windowsill here, and as the window goes up and down it can scratch the window, and you'll see on this vehicle, which is not particularly old, it's got a couple of scratches just here. They can be polished out. It's not particularly easy to polish them out, and if they're too deep often that won't be very effective anyway. So look at the glass, and if it's there, you'll have to make your own decision of how much you want to negotiate around this, but the problem is once it's there, you will spot it every time you walk up to your vehicle, particularly in the sunlight. That little scratch is going to shout at you every time. So before you purchase, just see if there are any scratches on the windows and then have a conversation with the customer about what that might mean to the vehicle price. So here we are in the cabin of this Range Rover, and it is a lovely place to be. I find this, you know, ergonomically it's really nicely set out, but these interiors don't come without their frustrations. The leather on these Jaguar Land Rover vehicles is really lovely, but my own personal opinion, I actually find it oddly a little bit too soft. Not that it doesn't feel fabulous, but it marks really, really easily. A ring or even a sharp fingernail can scratch the steering wheel leather surprisingly easily, and if you look around the trim, you'll really find it's quite easy to scratch the door cards, the centre console leather. In fact, this one's got a little mark here, and that's really common that it can pick up these marks. And the seats too, the bolsters on the side become surprisingly worn surprisingly quickly. Now, the good news is most of these leather repairs can be done quite easily. There are professionals now that have set themselves up to do exactly these sort of minor repairs, but it is something you want to look for, both front and back. You might find that either a briefcase or something like that has been put on the back seats. They're very, very easily scratched. So take your time, have a good look around all the trim, all the leather trim, and see if there's any little marks and scratches, and again, something you might want to have a discussion with the owner. The other thing that might drive you absolutely insane, and I can personally speak with experience of this, are some of the wonderful gizmos in these cars, satellite navigation particularly. My last vehicle, it drove me absolutely mad. The satellite navigation would very often, frankly, just not turn on. You just had a completely black screen. Turn the ignition off, let everything power down, turn it on, and it would come back on. Sometimes it would have a bright red screen and it would just stay there. The other thing it would do quite often, in having a mind of its own, in a night driving situation, it would decide to turn on the satellite navigation in daytime mode, literally like a great big headlight shining out of the dashboard. Not necessarily the easiest thing to inspect for, but do take your time, and this is really important. Make sure the satellite navigation is working. Make sure the heated seats are working. Make sure the windows go up and down uninterrupted. It's not unusual for them to go halfway up, find some resistance and start going down and things like that. Lots of little quirky, annoying things can go wrong with these cars. So take your time, go through all the gearbox drive mode settings, the ride height settings, make sure you've got no warning lights that come on if you've got the vehicle sitting there at idle. And as I say, make sure things like the cruise control and all of these functions work properly, but particularly particularly the media system. Make sure that displays correctly and that it seems to function correctly and things like that, because they are really annoying and quite niggly. These vehicles can also be a little bit prone to water leaks, quite often from the sunroof or the door seals or under the bulkhead. So as you're looking around the vehicle, get down again, unfortunately, on your hands and knees and feel all around the carpets, under the seats as much as you can, into the footwells. You're feeling for any dampness at all. The seals, it's not particularly easy to inspect them and see where they're leaking from, but sunroof seals particularly can be a problem on these vehicles. And what you'll notice is wet spots on the carpet inside, or you might find that there's misting occurring inside the vehicle if you start the vehicle up. Mist inside a vehicle is almost certainly an indication of moisture, something else you want to be looking for. So if we're happy with how the vehicle is now looking inside and out, and we've got a good feeling about it, it's looking like a genuine vehicle that has been looked after, it's probably time we start thinking about a road test. But before we do that, I need you to arm yourself with a fault code diagnostic machine. And this is really, really important. These Range Rovers love to collect fault codes. Now, quite often they're not particularly serious, and even things like low battery voltage can cause a whole range of codes. But you need to know what these codes are before you buy this vehicle. So diagnostic machines these days are incredibly cheap. 50, 60 pounds on eBay will get you a tool that will talk to this car and tell you what fault codes it's got, and you do need to do this. So plug in your diagnostic fault code reader, make a note of any codes. With the customer's and owner's permission, you can clear those codes down, and what I want you to do is make a note of them. You're going to go on road test and we're going to see if any come back. And if any come back in a short road test, you now know you've got a permanent fault code. This is not an intermittent code. This is something the vehicle is shouting out, is saying something is wrong with me here. You need to be able to look up that code and make sure you understand exactly what you're getting into now. Do not buy any vehicle that has an immediate permanent fault code that comes back on a road test without understanding exactly what you're looking at. It's time for road test. If you're comfortable with everything else, let's start the vehicle up. Now, hopefully the owner has listened to you and the vehicle is cold. So start her up, get out of the vehicle, and let's listen and look for a couple of things. It's not going to be unusual to see quite a little bit of white smoke or condensation coming out of the exhaust system, steam if you like. That's perfectly normal on these vehicles, but it should clear only after a couple of minutes or two. You'll often get a little bit of tapping too from the engine from cold start. Again, perfectly normal, but after a minute or two, as the engine starts to warm up, that wants to stop. And these are things you want to have a listen for. You remember, we're going to be listening for scrapey timing chains, noisy superchargers, maybe any oil residue burning out from the exhaust system, for example. So don't be too keen to run out on road test. Let the vehicle warm up on idle. Have a good look around it and make sure things are sounding, smelling and looking right before we head out on road test. If everything sounds good and we're comfortable, out on road test. Now, this is not your vehicle yet, so I don't want you to be flashing it around senselessly, but I do need you to drive it quite hard. Plant your foot and make sure of a number of things. There's no supercharger noise. The steering doesn't veer at all, so when you plant your foot, it pulls in a nice straight line. That's a really good sign. You want to make sure it goes through all of the gears. These gearboxes can be a bit glitchy at higher mileage. I always recommend doing an oil and filter change every 50,000 miles. That really, really helps. It might be something you want to ask the customer if they've had a gearbox oil and filter change done. But you definitely want to make sure that it goes through the gears, it doesn't hold on too long, and there's no slipping of gears either. That's really important. So take her up to a nice speed, within the legal speed limit, of course, and make sure that she's holding the road nice and square. And then I need you to plant your foot on the brake, when it's safe, of course, to do so, and plant your foot on the brake pretty damn hard. And again, we're looking for a pull to the left, a pull to the right. It should stay dead centre to the road and just plant itself to a nice firm stop. No strange noises, no vibrations coming from the front or the back that could indicate worn suspension bushes and warp discs and things like that. So firm acceleration, firm braking, vehicle needs to feel nice and firmly planted on the road. That's a really, really good sign. Keeping that speed back now up, we want a nice firm right hand bend and a nice firm left hand bend. Now, these vehicles sit on air. They do feel a little bit wobbly when pushed on a corner, but they still should go around a corner pretty well without feeling ridiculously wobbly. If things start to feel really quite wobbly, that's an indication of worn and tired suspension bushes most likely. Again, something you might want to look at. I would always recommend doing a road test of at least 20 miles. Now I know some people would like raise their eyebrows at that, but you're about to spend quite a lot of money on this vehicle, no doubt, and you want to make sure it's the right one for you. Any would-be seller would be more than happy for you to do at least 20 miles on a road test, and I would say that is a minimum. At the end of the road test, park her back up. Let's plug in that diagnostic machine and see if any of those codes have come back. Any diagnostic codes that have come back in that road test that short, you've got yourself a problem. Leave the engine on idle. Let's open the bonnet again. Now we're looking for any signs of any coolant leak from under the bonnet, those wisps of steam we talked about, any strange smells. Again, check the exhaust gases too and make sure that there's nothing, no black smoke, no blue smoke, for example. No scrapey noises coming from the engine, etc., etc. These engines should sit, particularly once they're warm, very, very quiet, purring away. No strange noises at all should be evident, and no scrapey noises particularly is what you're listening for under the bonnet. So in many ways that really is the full extent of my lookout list. Quite a short list really, and I think really a lot of that is because these vehicles are very good, but I'm hoping that's helped you to some extent. I'm hoping you may have found a few things now that might help you in the negotiation with the customer, and I wish you all the very best with your purchase and your ownership of your Range Rover. If you've got any questions at all, as always, you can email us at info@vizu.com. You can click the link in this video to get to our website, and we very much look forward to hearing from you and working with you in the future.